Good morning still for 30 seconds. So welcome to this session. We got a couple of minutes before kicking off to the birth of new alliances. So these 3/4 of the panels will be English speaking. So take headphones because a large part of it will be in English. So I'm here with Bertrand Badré, invited by the Cercle des Économistes, president of the Blue Like Investment Fund, who will introduce this fascinating session. And my name is Stéphanie Antoine. I will kick off the debate on, I represent the debate on France 24 every day. So with no further ado, I will introduce the panelists. Mario Loyola with us today, a senior fellow in law, economics and technology at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you. Ling Yao, both. You say, so good, you're director of European Studies. Think tank is called Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Happy to have you in X as well. André Louvskrug-Pietri. Hello, President of JEDI. JEDI is a European research organization. And we also have Yang Kernitsi. Hello. You're head of Department of Economics and Innovation. It's a think tank for which you've been working. You work with the Konrad, Adenauer, Stiftung. And Omar, who is a professor in Doha Institute for Graduate Studies at the University of Exeter. And so you've all been introduced, Bertrand Badré. Bertrand, you introduce this session. Si tu fais l'introduction.
Il suffit que tu parles dedans, ça marche normalement. Non?
If you speak into the microphone, it should work. We've got a little problem with the sound here. We've just got a problem with the microphone. So Bertrand Badré. Does it work? Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome to people who are just arriving. So I'm really delighted to introduce this session, which is part of a new approach of the Circle of the Economists this year, where we decided to open up a number of sessions with people from think tanks coming from around the world. I've been taking part in these sessions for 24 years, and I don't think I've ever seen such a diverse panel in terms of intellectual contributions and geographic contributions. So thank you for this opportunity to the organizers. So when we talk about new alliances, it's true that intuitively we tend to look to the past, which is fairly easy. We think about what the alliances used to be, and we think about how it's changed and what's changing. It's easy to analyze what's happening, but it's much harder to look at what is going to happen and to have an idea of what's emerging. Of course, there was a general comfort, a relative comfort of the Cold War, as it were, which now seems a long time away. In 2015, of course, this was the Paris Accords on the climate, the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations, and also the Conference of Development, which we celebrated the birthday anniversary of last year. And at that time, Barack Obama and Xi Jinping shook hands. And I thought this handshake between these two people would open up a new era. But actually, 10 years later, it seemed like this handshake was actually the end of the previous era, the era that opened up in 1989, 1990, and was called the end of history. And so at that period, we experienced the end of history, and we've been feeling our way to see what is going to follow this. After that, we had Brexit, then we had the first mandate of Donald Trump, and we had the change with the Communist Party in China. So the order that came into place after the Second World War, the United Nations Charter, etc., we're seeing cracks in this order. When I was General Director of the World Bank, I want to recognize the BRICS banks, and we saw that competition, we thought the competition was a good thing, but you can see in terms of the initial plan 10 years ago, things have got a lot further and a lot faster, and we can see a multipolar world developing. It's not only a multipolar, which is not a bad thing as such, but actually we're seeing these poles confronting one another. So in the previous session, we were talking about defense, technology, migration. All of these subjects are showing the fracture lines, which means that alliances are becoming harder and harder. I remember my first steps in international governance in the G7 or G20, where it was quite difficult to imagine how we could see agreement coming together with so much diversity around the table. Now it's becoming even harder and harder as we move to a world which is no longer thinking about a win-win approach, but is approaching a zero-sum game approach. We are now talking a lot, we're talking about chainsaws rather than unity. We're seeing concepts emerging. We're talking about multi-alignments, coalition of the willing. We're talking about the global south. There's an alliance, the NATO alliance, which was seen as unmovable, but this is starting to crack. In this context, we're finding rules coming back to rules that we've forgotten, not just rules about behavior, but also standards associated with governance. We're going to talk about all of this, but there's another issue I'm also concerned about, which there are challenges of globalization, not globalization as we knew it and the regulation of behavior, but actually we have challenges, planetary challenges, the climate challenge, of course, but not only the climate challenge. Alliances being developed only for technological and commercial objectives, but despite the fragmentation, are we going to be able to come together about what brings us all together as one humanity on the planet? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bertrand. This sets the stage. Let's start with you, Mario Loyola. Microphone. Yes, it does. Yes. So, senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation, for those who are listening to us, the think tank that established the Donald Trump Program 2, and you were part of Donald Trump Program 1, which was somewhat different. So, is it your vision, that of the Heritage Foundation today with Trump, with the Heritage Foundation, do we sign the end of the U.S. order from 1945?
No, not at all. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with all of you. What we're seeing now, I think, is since the end of the Cold War, a multipolar world that has marked by instability, marked by shifting alliances. But it is still the same world that we've lived in for several centuries, in which we have a competition among the world's major constitutional systems to see which one can deliver the greatest prosperity and security for its people. We won the Cold War against a system that was very weak, not just economically, but also because it was weak economically, it was in the end very weak militarily, despite all the appearances of the strong Soviet military. Now we see in China the rise of a power that is would love to hear more on this point. But we look at China and we ask ourselves, what system is this? It is not like the Soviet Union. I'm Cuban. It's not like any communist country I've ever heard of. And we see a paradox, which is a system that is increasingly able to deliver both prosperity and security for its people. Why? Because even though it's socialist in concept, it's increasingly free market and capitalist in practice, somewhat the opposite of the West, unfortunately. And so one factor that I would focus everyone's attention on is that has received very little attention, but will hopefully receive more attention in the years ahead, is the fact that China has discovered how to have the cheapest, most reliable, most abundant electricity of any industrial power in the West, at the same time as electricity is getting more expensive and more unreliable in the Western world as a result of the pursuit of climate policies. This is a long-term danger for our systems compared to the Chinese systems, and I would just say one point about the world's alliances on this. That what we need is not a new alliance, but a new mission for an old alliance, which is NATO. I think that NATO needs to go back to its original conception to embrace industrial power. Yeah? Oh. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
that NATO needs to get back to embrace the objective of economic growth and industrial power. representing the global interests of its members, and also the flexibility of those members to act to solve the problems that each of them individually may be most concerned with. And one thing that the NATO countries need to make a commitment to is energy abundance. This is something that I hope everyone will remember from this conference, is that a great long-term danger to Western democracies is the problem of energy scarcity. And by embracing the goal of energy abundance, we can open the door to a new alliance, I will say, with the Global South. Because we've seen at the COP, the climate COP the last several years, that the governments of India, African governments are showing up and saying, we're not going to sacrifice human development for climate action. And I would say that this is the correct posture, and it should be our posture as well. Because at the end of the day, the reason why we worry about climate change is because of the danger that climate change poses to human development. And so human development is what must come first.
Une question sur est-ce qu'on peut pas...
A question is, can we talk about alliances in the US of Trump? Does alliance mean anything?
The United States has maintained its firm commitment to NATO. But again, the United States, let's remember why, let's say, Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from the military command structure of NATO 60 years ago. The reason was that he wanted to preserve France's flexibility of action, the flexibility of France to act in its own interests. And what I think will strengthen the NATO alliance, and I don't speak for the Trump administration, but I think this is the view of the White House now, is that the members of NATO need to demonstrate the capacity to act in the interests of the alliance. And this means, to give an example, we just saw Israel and the United States had strikes against Iran's nuclear program. This is a problem that the NATO should have solved 20 years ago. This should not have been an Israeli operation. This should have been a NATO operation, and it should have happened 20 years ago. Why? Because Iran's nuclear program is a threat to all the NATO countries.
Donc ce n'est plus la Russie l'adversaire principal.
So Russia is no longer the key adversary of NATO now.
NATO, of course, was created to confront the threat of Soviet communism. What we have in Vladimir Putin is a return to the imperialism of Tsarist, something resembling more the imperialism of Tsarist Russia. I would say that the problem of Ukraine is a very difficult problem because the 1991 borders of Ukraine were the product of Soviet policy, and they were compatible with a country that is dominated by Russia, but not fully compatible with a country that wanted to be part of Europe and independent from Russia. And so conflict was baked into the 1991 borders of Ukraine in a way that I think people still don't understand. But to the extent that NATO sees correctly the Ukraine war as a very serious challenge, again, it is more of a challenge for the European side of NATO than for the US side of NATO. And the US and the European side needs to show that it's willing to put its money where its mouth is, that it's willing to put resources into achieving the supposed goal of the war.
André Loscruc-Pietri, vous pouvez peut-être...
André Loscruc-Pietri, maybe you could respond to what Mario's being saying about this new alliance and this conception of NATO, which is perhaps a bit different. This is an alliance that was born in 1949, so it is part of this post-war architecture. So we've got Europeans that need to rearm, that's part of it, but they also are starting to focus on the South. That's what Mario Doyle said. Perhaps I could just say something. I feel like a bit of an outsider in this panel because I'm not a think tank. It's true that we spend about 50% of our time trying to anticipate, because I think the real subject for most democracies is the future of democracy. And what we try to do is define the future that we want and not have a future imposed on us by others. So just perhaps to step aside from this and to step back slightly, we've talked a lot about Donald Trump, and he has this expression which is that you're going to hear about winning, and you'll be tired of winning. So the question we need to ask ourselves about new alliances: what is working in the 21st century today? So we hear a lot these terms about Europe is a herbivore in a world of carnivores. I think we've all heard this. I'm not going to go into that. I would say that we could even go much further. We could say that there are vertebrates that know that know what they want, and there are vertebrates that don't know what they want. And those people who don't know what they want are going to lose. Who are these? Says the moderator. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, speaker. What I'd say as well is also the speed is a key issue. I've been here for 3 hours and I've heard about how much money needs to be put into the social contract, into innovation, into research. It's clear today that more money is better than less money. But what really counts today is speed. Speed. Speed is the key factor of success. And today, people that go faster than others are those that are going to impose their model on others. And people that define the agenda, they are going to crush others, because I haven't got another term. That's the best term I've got. The third aspect so that alliances work is that we're still talking about institutions. And in our European countries, we're really focused on institutions. And we no longer talk about the American presidency. Now we talk about Donald Trump. We no longer talk about the Communist Party in China. We talk about Xi Jinping. We no longer talk about Russia, but about Putin. So who do we talk about in Europe? Well, once again, we talk about people, because these people are giving a rhythm. So the moderator, this is the problem of the telephone call to someone to make something happen. Yes, I think there's a lot of opportunities. The fourth thing is this question of contrast. I heard Jacques Attali earlier saying this subject of long-term, and I think he's absolutely right. This is my fourth point. Alliances that work are alliances that are thinking to the future. They're not fighting yesterday's war. They've not got NATO's plans on yesterday wars, but they've got NATO's plans for the war of the future. Like what war? Well, in Europe, for example, we hadn't at all anticipated. But if we'd listened to the Baltic states, we could have anticipated what happened in Russia. We could have anticipated what's happening in the Middle East. We probably could have anticipated a bit more on that. And I don't necessarily agree with everything here, but I think we could have anticipated better in terms of innovation. These are the budgets that we really need to invest in. The people that are winning today are authoritarian countries that have this luxury, as it were, for bad reasons, to have a long-term vision. So in order to put in place alliances, we need to bring together this idea of vision, of a backbone, and then really to act. I hear a lot of frustration today about the report, about I've got the Ministry of Industry saying we're going to do an inventory, and I am from Corsica, so I have sympathy with him, but there's an inventory of mines. But no, in 2 months, a lot of car industry factories are going to shut down because they have no more rare metals. So we need to work on these things, and that will make it possible for us to put in place alliances.
Lignao. Bonjour. You're director of the European Study Chinese Academy and Industrial Trade and Economic Cooperation. Of course, you have to answer to Mario Loyola, who says China is well ahead when it comes to prices on energy, the prices law. Do you agree with the way he described China, which is the main rival of the US?
The world order. Il faut que vous mettiez votre micro. Yeah. Closer your mic.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So show my opinions about the end of the world order.
It is.
Yeah, okay.
Donc sur cette fin de ce monde de 1945, quelle est la vision chinoise?
What's the Chinese vision?
I'm Yao Ling from China, and thank you, Stephanie. And in my opinions, the World Economic Order, since it's established after World War II, has been actually in transformation, especially when we're talking about the global trading system. During the almost 40 years, from the 1948, the birth of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to 1995, the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Trade liberalization had occupied the center of the global trading system, and we can see a lot of tariff reduction between European country and the Asia country, and also American country and the African country. And also we can see some more open markets, not only in goods trade, but also in service trade. However, after the 2008, the outbreak of the international financial crisis, the trade liberalization encountered a strong backlash, giving the negative effects of trade liberalization, such as the widening the income gaps and the increasing the structural unemployment have accumulated and paid less attention to on the society level. So we can find since the 2016, the global trading system was deeply undermined. And we can see the reform of the WTO has been outstanding, even being as the existential issues to the WTO. And under the current global trading system, the United States, the EU, and the EU, China, and also the developing countries like the BRICS have all the important forces. I think they can play their roles of the different alliance based on the different consensus. When we focused on the supporting the multilateralism or addressing the climate change or protecting the biodiversity, China and the EU have much consensus. So the cooperation between China and the EU contribute not only to their own economic and social development, but also promote the inclusive economic globalization. That's all my opinions.
That's your opinion. And avec l'Europe.
With Europe, which is implementing a tariff politics against Chinese vehicles to protect its own automotive industry. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, you don't have a...
Yeah.
Just the tariffs that the European countries actually are putting right now on China's automobile. What do you think of that? Because it's to protect the industry in Europe, that it's not open anymore to China the way it used to be.
Yeah, I think the tariff measures imposed by the United States imposed sweepingly to its trading partners, not only the China but also the EU. So for China, we would like to cooperate with most of our trading partners under the current global trading system. Yeah.
Donc voilà, c'est intéressant quand même de voir.
So that's interesting. Thank you, Jan Cienici. To move on to you, China is supporting this this OMT, the WTO world, America much less. What would be your approach and perspective on this shift from 1945? Do you think this is the end of multilateralism as we have known it? You were talking about the WTO, the NATO, of course, which needs to be transformed. How do you see this?
For the question, so I would also have many comments to what the people before said, so I would be glad to discuss afterwards on other topics, but I start with that one. I mean, we live in a time where many people say the multilateral order has collapsed, has broken down, that is not working anymore. Would first of all like to make the point that that is not true. So we still have a multilateral order. We have the United Nations, we have the WTO, we have things like we had forgotten on, but now we remember, like the International Atomic Energy Organization, that obviously is still relevant. But all the mentioned organizations and much more don't work to their full capacity anymore. Many things don't work anymore because there are strong actors that don't believe in the value of cooperation anymore. And that makes it nearly impossible to have clear regulations and semi-laws on the global level that bind all the countries closer. That bind all the countries to accept these laws, these regulations. And that leads to a situation in which we still have the organizations I mentioned, but we need other forms of cooperations, other alliances, some kind of ad hoc alliances, in which countries solve the problems that cannot be addressed anymore by the big overarching organizations on the global level. And that will only work if we believe in cooperation. And that's something I would actually like to discuss with Mario later, because I believe that a kind of zero-sum game in which governments think there's only one thing, either I grab it or somebody else, and that leaves no room for cooperation. I still highly believe, and I think it's proven, that cooperation leads to gains on both sides of the cooperation, and that we always need to look for institutions and also for the will to cooperate, and that we are not...
No, c'était pour le... It's for him. So we can, yeah, so we can... Go ahead, finish.
So that we should still always remember that cooperation brings gains to both sides, and that in a zero-sum game in which just one side seeks to maximize its gains, all sides lose, also the ones that would consider themselves the winners. So I see the new world we have to look at. We have existing alliances that are still there. We have to nurture them and develop them. We have to look at new alliances in spaces where we don't have them to make it possible to cooperate, and we need to believe in cooperation.
Sorry, new alliances between who and who?
Between multiple partners. So we have different aspects. If you look, for example, at cooperation with the EU and China, I think there are quite some options in the economic sectors to cooperate on norms, for example, on specific things regarding climate change. I would see chances to find ways of cooperation. I'm sure there is no feasible way to cooperate on security issues, for example, between the EU and China. So we'll come to a world in which we have to look at the topics we want to talk about, then look which partners can we work with, and then try to form ad hoc alliances. It will be many of them, it will be lots of work.
Une approche pragmatique, en quelque sorte.
Yes.
So this is a kind of pragmatic approach you're suggesting. Do you want to respond here? Yes, I wanted just to respond, because we're talking about alliances, but the big mistake that we've been making for the last 20 years, and I think the WTO has been a massive, a characteristic error here, because if we want to work on the illusion of efficiency and a kind of fact that we don't say things like they really are. So it's clear that the WTO has made it possible for China to become a clandestine passenger of international trade. So that's just a false debate. The second thing, I was at the NATO summit in The Hague last week. A lot of European countries came saying we've given 5% to Trump, but nevertheless we're not going to be able to do it because Spain doesn't want to do it, because France doesn't have the resources to do it. And so we're creating the seeds of the conflict of tomorrow. So I think there is value in not working with illusion. That's the great European disease, this idea that we're the most competitive, we have the best scientists. You're saying this is arrogance, says the moderator? No, it's not arrogance. I just think we're living in a parallel reality. With the invertebrates that we are, the herbivores that we are, we're spineless, and I'm wearing a green hat here, and it's not red, and it's focused on Europe, but in our alliances, in our relationships between states, so let's talk about something else which is not to do with alliances. France and Germany, this great partnership between France and Germany, this will be celebrated with the heads of states, with a lot of businesses, but all defense, French, German, defense projects have not come off. Nobody says this. In the Bourget air show, people were still playing with the illusion, but nobody's saying this isn't working. I think in our alliances, we need to say to China the truth. We need to say to the USA the absolute truth and say that we're worried about Article 5. The Americans have said it like it is to us in terms of our investment in defense, and even more to the Germans than to the French. And this is the adult world in which we need to enter into.
Parole.
Omar, sure, you may take the floor. So, you're British, so interesting to have the British vision about this end of the old 1945 order, and what's the position of England or the UK when it comes to alliances?
Approchez bien le micro, hein, the mic close to your mouth. Please.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and thank you for the question. Well, there is the official position, the opposition position, and
your position,
and my position. Yeah, so I'm speaking for myself to be very fair. I'll just paint a picture, and it aligns with what some of my colleagues have already said. So part of the picture is that post-1945 and post-1991, 92, the threat environment has changed significantly. So now we have nuclearly armed states. One of them is willing to lose 30,000 per month in terms of casualties to fight an offensive war. It's not a defensive war to defend Moscow, it's an offensive war to take part of another country. Mind you, the Russian Federation lives on 40% of the European continent. All the rest of us, from Britain all the way to Estonia, Finland, and Ukraine, living on 60%. Okay, so they do not need more territory. But they're willing to lose 30,000 in terms of casualties, casualties meaning death, wounded, POWs, defected and missing, for a period of months, we can say. And willing to continue that war. That makes them a very conventionally dangerous opponent or a dangerous adversary, but also that state is nuclearly armed. So the threat environment is changing. The alliance shape is changing. So the alliance looks on paper great. It looks that, you know, since the 1990s, the NATO membership has increased by 15 members, okay? But if you looked at the capabilities-wise, the capabilities have declined significantly. It's halved in terms of artillery capabilities, in terms of armor capabilities, in terms of numbers, pure numbers of soldiers. So the alliance on paper looks great, but the capabilities are declining. If you looked at the commitment of the alliance, is also very shakeable. We all remember in 1994 there was a Budapest memorandum that was signed and guaranteed to make Ukraine, to denuclearize Ukraine, so hand over the nuclear weapons. And that Budapest memorandum was guaranteed by the Russian Federation, the United States, and the United Kingdom, my country, unfortunately, and also France and China were witnesses to that. And in the end, when Ukraine got really invaded and had no nuclear weapon to defend itself, had no convention capabilities to do so, the Obama administration and the Merkel chancellorship told them, we will get Crimea back with diplomacy and some sanctions. So there is think of that if something happened in the Baltics. So in terms of the commitment of the alliance to support smaller states who are not nuclear and less capable conventionally to fight an adversary that, again, is willing to lose that amount of soldiers. And finally, in terms of the threat environment, there is also non-state adversaries. So in terms of hybrid and proxy warfare, the capabilities are still there in terms of abusing or using terrorism across Europe in terms of arsenal and other forms of, shall we say, hybrid arsenals. That is also available in terms of non-state forces. So if you have that threat environment, going back to the UK, then we just have our strategic security review, and it highlights many of these issues. The planning is there, the execution is not. And we're still lagging quite behind.
C'est souvent le cas. Merci beaucoup.
In the case, Mario Loyola, we talked about the war in Ukraine, so of course I have to ask you a question to react to what Omar ASHOUR just said. Why the US did decide to pull out the delivery of the Patriot weapons, to pull this delivery of patriots to the Ukrainians, and therefore they're now more vulnerable versus the menace, the threat of from Russia.
State a very difficult issue, which is to some extent a sui generis issue. There are parallels to the Baltics, because certainly Putin would love to reconstitute the Russian Empire. That's true, but I think that Russia sees itself, rightly or wrongly, as caught in an existential struggle, and this makes Russia very dangerous because it is willing to sustain casualties of 30,000 a month. It's willing to lose 1 million people to preserve Mariupol within Russian control, and the European countries are not willing to lose 1 million people to get Mariupol back. So at the end of the day, I think this is a lawsuit over the Soviet legacy. It's one last ticking time bomb left behind by the Soviet Union. And some kind of conflict, I think, tension was inevitable over this issue once the Ukrainian people decided that they wanted to be part of Europe and that they did not want to be part of Russia. And so this needed to be accommodated, and it could not be accommodated in time. The Minsk agreements could not be implemented, et cetera, et cetera. But what has been obvious is that the stated aim of Ukraine and the Western governments, which is the liberation of the totality of the 1991 borders, is, you could say, the only principled aim under international law, but it is impossible. It is just impossible. Why? Because the Russians are willing to lose many more people to prevent that from happening than the Europeans are willing to lose to make it happen. And so a compromise is inevitable. And what the United States sees, and I think what Western European governments are going to see increasingly, is to push the two sides to a settlement that can be the basis for peace. I think that a long-term problem that Europe faces and NATO faces that's more complicated is the rise of China and how to accommodate the rise of China, the rise of the military and industrial power of China in a peaceful way that reinforces the international system instead of bringing instability. And here I would just ask you to think about the situation in Europe 120 years ago when we saw a very similar authoritarian system in Germany that was producing enormous economic power, enormous industrial power, enormous military power. The challenge was how to accommodate the rise of this system peacefully, and we failed.
Oui, mais juste sur le processus de paix, Donald Trump a dit qu'il voulait la paix.
But in terms of the peace process, Donald Trump said he wanted peace between Ukraine and Russia. At his recent press conference, he said that Putin was more difficult to deal with than he'd imagined. So within the Heritage Foundation, how do you see the American leadership on this question? Because we can see this transactional approach, which is the key to Trump's policy approach internationally. It doesn't work.
West and administrations going back to the Obama administration failed to prevent the war in Ukraine and have exacerbated the war in Ukraine is insufficient carrots and insufficient sticks. The failure has been, going back 20 years, I would say that the United States has not missed a single opportunity to inflame the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. At every turn, they have prevented what could have been a peaceful resolution of the conflict and have made and have helped to make military conflict more attractive for Russia than a compromise solution. And so I think that right now we have to make sure that we're not repeating the same mistake again. So I would say that we have to continue military support for Ukraine.
Oui, donc vous êtes en désaccord avec la dernière décision du Pentagone, alors?
So
individual decisions, I don't think those decisions are well understood. I'm not going to address individual decisions.
Okay.
But I think that that the key thing is that I think that Russia is bluffing when it says that it won't accept NATO troops in Ukraine. I think that Russia has, by focusing on Crimea and Donbass, has resigned itself to the inevitability of Ukrainian membership in NATO down the road. But in the meantime, what has to happen is that the European governments of NATO have to show that they are willing to defend Ukrainian sovereignty, at least within the territory that Ukraine holds now, from further Russian aggression. And so to say we can compromise on the territory We can negotiate over the territory that's been fighting over thus far, but no further. And I think it's very important for the European governments to step up and make that commitment, not just by selling weapons, but I think by putting soldiers on the ground. And this commitment will send a very clear message, even to Washington.
Merci. Yann CERNICKY, vous vouliez...
Thank you very much. I think Yann CERNICKY wanted to respond.
But it seems to work now, yeah? Yes, I wanted to respond on Mario because I noted that down when you spoke for the first time, you mentioned that NATO, from your side, would be important to try to cooperate on economic power, to be able to produce weapons. You said cooperation on energy markets. Now you mentioned to be able to cope with China on an economic basis. That is not what NATO is made for, from my understanding. From my understanding, NATO is clearly a defense alliance in which we come together and just want to be prepared for aggression from the outside and be able to defend ourselves. Here, the other aspects you mentioned, the Europeans have the European Union for that. And of course, the US is invited to cooperate with the European Union on aspects of energy, of trade, on economic cooperations. I would be very glad if we discuss about things like TTIP again. That would be a great thing to do. But I would be, I'm actually surprised that you don't mention defense when you speak about NATO, but all the other aspects that from the European perspectives are not part of NATO.
Vous répondez. Ça marche moins bien. Celui-là marche pas. Ah si, c'est bon, c'est bon. Ok, ça ira. Vous répondez et je fais réagir le reste des panélistes, hein, Mario.
It's work? No, okay. Maybe I'm being censored. So I would say that it's been obvious since I think the end of the Cold War posed, this is something that's been discussed by NATO for 3 decades now, that the end of the Cold War meant that NATO had succeeded in its original mission of defending the territory of NATO. And then the question was, if NATO is to be relevant, what's its mission going to be in the post-Cold War world? And the action in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, gave the first answer to this, which is that in order to continue to be relevant, NATO has to be able to act within the near abroad, not on the NATO territory, but just outside of the NATO territory. And then after 9/11, we had the next question was, okay, now in the global war on terrorism, after the attacks of 9/11, what can the relevance of NATO be? And at that time, the Bush administration had the doctrine of the global expeditionary mission for NATO. NATO has global interests. It needs to be able to project power abroad. So for example, in the negotiations over NATO member contributions to the common defense, the Bush administration pointed out that France had no tankers to refuel airplanes with. So therefore, it couldn't conduct any Air Force missions beyond the national territory of France or 500 miles from the national territory of France. Afghanistan was the test of this. This is why the United States insisted on making Afghanistan a NATO mission. And the failure, ultimately, of this in Afghanistan is one that people should be really thinking about in terms of what is the success that can attend upon NATO with a global mission. But I would say that NATO that only focuses on the territorial defense of NATO countries is an irrelevant NATO.
Vous pouvez répondre, André Le Scrupietri, là-dessus. Justement, est-ce que l'OTAN a les moyens, d'ailleurs, de devenir...
So you can answer this question, André Le Scrupietri. Does NATO have the power to become a planetary power? Well, what they know very well that NATO doesn't have its own troops. NATO is a massive machine of command post and interoperability, so it puts in place defense plans with common defense plans. Today, NATO and the member states of NATO are dependent on the firepower of America, and particularly the power for organization of America. Here's a figure that the Europeans, together with Britain, put in 50% of the American defense budget, so that's not nothing, but they only have 10% of capacity for refueling, as we've heard, for projection, for information intelligence by satellites. So it's a very low capacity. And then we say, well, everyone's buying F-35s. Well, we need to put in the effort to build real common tools, because this is coming in as a kind of harmonizing tool. Moderator, this is going to be the case with the European rearmament program. Answer. Yes, this has been the case over the last 3 years, since 2022 and the Russian invasion. 80%, 78% precisely, of additional defense spending in Europe have been spent on non-European industrial players, and most of them American. So we haven't used this massive opportunity. Now we're going to have more resources, but we need to see the world that we're in. And this is where I think we need to have a vision that evolves. What's happening today in Iran is having an impact, because ballistic missiles that have been fired at Tel Aviv could also hit Marseille and Aix-en-Provence, because also China, if one day perhaps China might put in place a blocus, a trade bloc, and it will be Europe which will be the first who will be impacted by this. When we'll put in place a tool through the Suez Canal, it's the economy and European societies that are impacted. So I think we have a vision of defense which depends on the economy, technologies. The vision of a defense alliance, I think, needs to be seen much more broadly. Omar, ASHOUR.
Can you, it's working now. Okay, just very briefly on the 3Ds, the deterrence and the diplomacy and the defense manufacturing. So in terms of the deterrence works. We know that collective deterrence works. So just a brief example, the Baltics, much easier targets. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were not invaded by the Russian Federation, partly because they are part of NATO. Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe after the Russian Federation, with 21 maneuver brigades, that was part of the defense reforms between 2014 and 2022. So a country that is large enough with teeth, but just got attacked because it's out of NATO. Okay, when you have 32 countries ready to defend you, that's a different story. So you're signaling.
Et on a l'impression qu'elle n'y rentrera jamais.
But we feel like Ukraine will never be part of NATO.
I'm just giving an example. Hopefully it will be. Hopefully it will be. And I am just giving an example of, you know, the failure of single country deterrence versus collective deterrence of NATO. So that was the main point. The second point on deterrence, actually, if you're signaling that you are serious, for example, in the Cold War, NATO reserved the right for the first nuclear strike because of the Soviet conventional superiority on the European continent in terms of artillery and tanks. They reserved the right to deter them. They had to resort to unconventional, and that was in the doctrine. So it signaled we're serious. Don't mess in Europe. So that's two. In terms of diplomacy, diplomacy was tried and tested multiple times. The largest artillery and armored battle that happened on the European continent before 2022 was in the Baltstva in 2015. This is after Minsk II agreements between, you know, sponsored and supported by the French presidency and the Merkel chancellorship. And it was between you know, President Poroshenko and President Putin, and it did not work. So diplomacy here, if it's not backed by actual strength and actual deterrence, it will not last, okay? And finally, on the defense manufacturing. Defense manufacturers, it's great to have a very solid defense industry, but it does not work with just switching a government or a political will. It's a long-term process. It's a long-term investment. You cannot say, I want to enhance my defense capabilities today, and then tomorrow the capabilities are enhanced. It takes years. So long-term investment here in the defense capabilities is very critical. And this bridging between, on one end, welfare and the economy of Europe and the defense of Europe should be bridged. It should be focused that actually the defense capabilities provide more jobs, provide more investment in the resources, in the local resources, and that strategic signaling should be laid out generally to the public, in the media, and so on, to bridge that gap.
Et ça va prendre du temps.
And that's going to take time. This objective.
Hence the strategy. Hence we need a strategy, a long-term one.
Et la guerre en Ukraine.
And the Ukraine war, people are saying that we're running out of time, so we need to get people from the room asking questions. Yes, we've got 10 minutes left. Sorry, we've gone way beyond time. Sorry about this. So I can see there's some questions. Please, sir, would you ask your question? I'm Mathieu Dupousseau. I'm a business leader from Germany. I'm a member of the French Industry of Administrators. But the change through trade has failed. We can see that mercantile approach that we have in Europe has made us very vulnerable. That's what we've heard today. And we have also seen that we have no European geopolitical alliance in terms of make Europe great again. I like the cap. Would it not be worthwhile for us to draw the geopolitical conclusion and come out of NATO to make our own alliance? Who wants to answer that question?
Peut-être Yann?
Yann? Do not forget today, well, this is a consensus that we agreed, NATO is the defense mechanisms of Europe. For a long time, there was an intention in France to get some kind of European pillar. You know, there was a lot of semantic diatribe. Look, in Sweden, Finland joined NATO, and they confirmed that it is the best solution. However, just a point about the illusion. Well, Ukrainians went from 100,000 to 1 million drone. So it's not a question of time ago, the simple drones, but for the last 3 years, our production capabilities in this country have improved by 28%. So let's not stop about war economy. We're not there yet. First, because we don't have the money. Second, because industrialists are waiting for orders. So we have to be more radical in the paradigm, because if tomorrow we get attacked, we got 5 days to hold on. Another question over there. Jan, would you like to react?
I mean, I think we will need both NATO and other alliances on the European level, and we have to be sure that the basis of all alliances that Europe can form is a strong, effective European Union that can speak with one voice. And for me, it doesn't matter if it's on defense, on supply chains, on climate change, on any other thing. It doesn't make lots of sense if individual European countries, even Germany, sit alone on a table next to China, the US, and India, other big countries. So the first thing we need to have is invest, and there's lots of investment to be done in the European capacities on alliance building, on all this aspect. It means a combination of diplomacy and sectoral know-how. We're not there yet. The French lead the way in a certain way on economic diplomacy. They're much ahead of there, but we need to invest in that, and only then we can always, as Europeans, see which kind of alliances do we want to have, where does it make sense, and then work on that in all the sectors. But that does not mean that we should abandon NATO. NATO is there and is relevant. We should make sure that it still works as far as it's possible. But if it's not, we have to, of course, have our options to find other alliances.
Et le nouveau chancelier, justement, est-ce qu'il y a un shift en Allemagne?
Is there a change in Germany with the new chancellor? Does he want more Europe or not?
I hope yes. So, I mean, the new German government, now in power for some months, I think showed strong signals in willing to have more European common activities. There's lots of discussions on the European level with all the partners. So I see a strong will in that, to take the lead, but also to cooperate, and to invest also means in that. Yeah.
Omar, ASHOUR, vous vouliez...
Omar, ASHOUR, would you like to respond to this question?
Very briefly, not to the question. I was just having a comment on the lines. Well, okay, so I'll stop then.
Oh, no, you could react for 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the alliance, on the quantity and the quality of the alliance. So the quantity of the alliance, it's great to have enhance the quantity in terms of alliances in South Korea, Japan, in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So the quantity is great. The quality is very, very important. The quality of the alliance, meaning the mass, how much people, how much depth we have. The method, are we having actually practical doctrines that can apply? The mindset, are the people actually realizing the threat and realizing how serious it is, and so on. So the quality is also important. Thank you.
La qualité, Mario Loyola.
quality. So Mario Loyola, just very quickly.
On top of all those factors that are important for the success of an alliance, there also has to be a visible willingness on the part of the governments to use that military power when they have to do it. And this is a big failing, right? If we had the United States has 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, but for 20 years the government of Iran didn't think we would use any of them to do anything about the nuclear program, so we might as well not have had any aircraft carriers. And I would say that one aircraft carrier battle group in the hands of a government that shows that it's willing to use it is more valuable than 10.
Bertrand, un mot de conclusion en 30 secondes.
Bertrand, in 36 seconds, you can just summarize. So you can just see, what you can see is that we have panels of people holding up panels to say how much time we have left. So thank you to all of you. I think the circle organizers are wanting to invite people who are thinking about these questions from around the planet. I think it's a really good idea, and it's something we need to continue. What I can see really some convergence is that we're all seeing that the world is changing. What's also, it might be easy to say that, and even there's a bit of debate around security questions. I've not heard any sense of dramatization. We're all accepting the fact that the world is changing. We're leaving behind nostalgia, and the question is that we need to see how we're going to adapt. And we agree that how easy it is to adapt depends on where we are on the planet and on our history. Secondly, the concept of alliances is changing, and therefore the concept of allies. This is a shock of realities. I think Andre reminded us this, that it's important to say truth as we see it. That's not always comfortable. So we're moving perhaps away from traditional alliances where we have more alliances of interests, more contractual alliances that are less based on values but more on short-term objectives. That means that we need to start thinking about the instruments of these alliances, the length of these alliances, are these closed or open alliances, and also I think Mario was saying at the beginning, there's this question about what do we want out of alliances. Of course, we all agree that we need to focus on greater prosperity and security. What's not very clear is whether it's prosperity or security of our own country or of our planet or any other intermediary form. That means that we also need to understand what other people want. And it means that we need to try and understand institutions, but also understand people. I recently saw Francis Fukuyama, who said that I've spent too much time doing political science and not enough time doing psychology. So we can see today that actually that would be useful. There's a discussion today on the role and missions of alliances today. We've seen that with NATO. The fourth point, this is a transatlantic question. This is one that really got us debating this question of the we haven't really talked about the trans-Pacific aspect, and we haven't talked very much about the global south. It's perhaps the party that's missing from this panel. We should think about that in future years. Here, this is not just about trade and technology. It was interesting to see this is a question about peace and war, a question where human lives are in play. So what are we doing at an institutional level, where we talked about the WTO and NATO? Are there institutions to create? Do we need to recognize that the alliances that we're talking about are part of a framework that now has been left behind? We're now talking about zero-sum games rather than win-win games. So what I need to leave you in the conclusion is this question about the fact that we need to keep our eyes open about what's happening, not accept illusions. And I think to conclude, I just want to share an anecdote from the previous century. 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met for the first time in Geneva to talk for talks between the two superpowers of the Cold War. This was fairly tense, and then they came out of the meeting room. They walked around the Lake Léman, and Gorbachev said, if the US was attacked by an extraterrestrial power, would you come and help us? Said Reagan, and Gorbachev said, of course we would, and asked the question back, and then Reagan said, yes, of course we would as well. So we need to have this in our minds. So we have all these differences and all these abrasive relationships, but there's something greater that goes beyond us. It's our planet and the life of people living on this planet. We need to keep in mind the essential. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Arribas.